It's essential that law enforcement have the non-lethal options at their disposal that don't include escalation or use of force. The bill restores these non-lethal tools. Happy to sign this bill.
Well, that's Governor Jay Inslee right there, signing off on some changes to police reform legislation that lawmakers in Olympia just approved in the past few days. So, what other things is he going to be signing into law as the legislative session wraps up this week? Also, what are the results of a new public safety plan from the city of Seattle? And why are there so many concerns about a measure to give raises to Uber and Lyft drivers? Well, honk if you love this podcast, folks. We're covering those stories and a lot more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. Very nice to be with you. The views expressed here are my own. And joining me is David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I wanted to make sure I checked in with you here. It sounds like there might be a plant crisis going on at your home. I've noticed a little angst on the Twitter feed there. What's going on, man?
Well, no, not so much a crisis, but it's just I start a lot of plants around this time of year, and
Yeah.
I put a lot of emotional weight on their success. So
Yeah.
everything's going okay so far, but plants have a
Okay.
way of dying, and so I'm scared what'll happen to my mood if they do.
I see. All right, well, hang in there. We're thinking good thoughts for you. And one of our
Yeah.
patrons is actually trying to support the cause here, I guess you'd say. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. And thanks to our patrons. I did want to point this out. We had Alice join us as a patron over the past week. Thank you very much, Alice, at the $10 level. So we will be sending her very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. I grabbed one. David's got one too. Thanks, man, for making it happen there. And our Mug Club members are featured on our mugshot of the week. And this is what I'm talking about, David. Our patron, Eric, he of the Backyard Chicken Coop here in Seattle. Eric is promising a full tour of the coop very soon. When that Too Hot for C-SPAN video comes our way, we'll make sure that you're all able to see it. But another wonderful photo sent in for this week. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to all of our patrons. If you listen, please do support the show, would you? Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. We're on Converge Media too, the video version of the podcast on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going here, right now. Well, David, the Seattle City Council has a number of things on the agenda this week, but I wanted to start at the state level because the legislature's short session is wrapping up this week. And for a 60-day session during an election year where we don't normally see much action, a lot of stuff is going down this week. I want to touch on a few issues, and if we could, police accountability to start with. So the legislature has passed two measures clarifying that officers can get involved in behavioral health crisis situations, and also they can use less lethal force. Some questions about that answered in a sense in what happened with the session this year. But two other measures are going down to the wire here. When officers can detain someone for questioning in what's called a Terry stop, when people might be trying to flee from an investigation. Another is when officers can use pursuits, potentially lowering that threshold. David, some thoughts about what's happening with these bills and police accountability maybe on a larger scale?
Yeah, a few of these bills were viewed as basically, fairly broad support for clarifying some of what was done last year, and those are the
Yeah,
ones that
from
moved
police
forward.
agencies as well as advocates, right?
Right. Specifically, I think of the involuntarily detain someone in a mental health crisis. That the sponsors of the original police reform bill said that they never intended police to not be able to do that, but the data shows pretty consistently that they had consistently detained fewer people in mental health crises. There was some debate over whether that was a fair reading of the law or not, but regardless of that debate, it was happening. Statistics showed, and so that there wasn't a lot of opposition, or it was fairly agreed upon that they should make explicit that police are allowed to involuntarily detain people. But some of the other measures, especially by progressives in the legislature, well, and folks outside of the legislature,
Yeah, right.
those go a little bit further than I think just clarifying some of the reforms of last year. And so, what we're seeing with some of the around Terry stops and vehicle pursuits is
Right.
If those pass, and where they have passed so far, they're doing so with a kind of mix of Democratic and Republican support. Like Democrats alone wouldn't have been able to pass
That's
these
right.
because the progressive wings of the party don't support some of these measures. So that's kind of interesting. That and I think is sort of a reflection of some folks kind of reading the political tea leaves a little bit and feeling like the support for some of these measures is not
Yeah.
as strong as maybe they had thought towards the end of the 2020 summer.
Right.
Um, and so, even the fact that some pieces of this reform legislation were allowed to come to the floor is
Mm-hmm.
interesting, because
Right.
usually in a Democratic controlled Congress, usually these pieces of legislation probably wouldn't even make it to the floor if they couldn't
Yeah.
pass with full Democratic support. So
Mm-hmm.
the fact that leadership in the Democratic Party is letting these come forward, knowing that it will it'll have to pass with a combination of Republican and
Right.
Democrats, is kind of
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
We'll see where that pans out, and also talking a little bit more with some of these different police agencies from around the state that want a little bit more agency, I guess you'd say, in terms of when pursuits start and things of that nature. So we'll see what happens with that one. But David, I know there's another piece of this that you're following closely. I'm going to hold off on that Uber and Lyft piece until the end of our show, but just looking at this overall transportation package that the state is working on here, $16.8 billion, that controversial gas tax measure we were talking about last week has been taken out. Have state Dems figured out how to fill that hole, or what's going on with this package?
Yeah, I mean, there's a decent chance things will change between when we record
Yeah,
this
this is
and when it
true. Yeah,
publishes, because things are very dynamic right now. But
right.
um, yeah, it's interesting, when this package was first unveiled a few weeks back. It was kind of viewed as, this thing will probably sail through pretty quickly, and it's got
Mhm.
all this Democratic support. But then, as you mentioned, um, a lot of pushback to $2 billion out of $16.8 billion
Mhm.
around this proposed tax on fuel being exported from the state. And so
Right.
that got too hot for Democrats. They have dropped it, but now they're kind of in this mad dash scramble, because they don't want to cut from their package.
Mhm.
At least not, they're not saying they want to do that yet. And so they're kind of in this mad dash scramble to find something to replace about $2 billion. So first they looked to the public works account, which is this
Right.
uh, not trying to avoid getting too deep into the weeds, but is this
Yeah.
account that basically is, there are tax dollars coming in specifically to set up like really low interest loans for local
Mhm.
governments to take out and do, put in a new water main,
Sure.
or what, pretty unsexy public
Yeah,
works
but
projects.
important stuff, right.
And so they proposed that, and that also ran into kind of a buzzsaw of opposition,
Mhm.
because it is a really popular program at the local level across all political spectrums. So, and
Uh-huh.
then, so that seems to be on its way out, if not already on its way out. And now they've kind of turned to this other account, which is tax revenue for toxic cleanups.
Oh,
Now,
boy.
this,
Okay.
um, again, not to get too weedy, I mean, it on its surface, it sort of sounds like they're taking money directly from toxic cleanups to pay for transportation.
Mhm.
In practice, it's a little more complicated than that, because it involves kind of swapping funds from one place to the other.
Mhm.
So they're saying, kind of complicated, but
Mhm.
this is also not. We're not hearing resounding support, at least not yet, for
Oh,
this
boy.
either.
Hmm.
And so, the I imagine. Uh, I'm- I was sort of expecting we would hear something about a deal on this at the end of last week, or maybe over the weekend, but we
Right.
haven't yet, which makes
Yeah.
me think they're having a hard time figuring
Wow.
this out, and they only have, I don't know, 3 days
Yeah, as
to
we're
do it.
recording this show,
So,
just 3 days, you bet. It's not a lot of time, and so, folks, I
no.
urge you to keep an eye on what David's writing in the Seattle Times here, because I know he's gonna be tracking this, and many things will be changing over the course of this week as the legislative session wraps up on March 10th. So, thank you for touching on those pieces with me, David. But I did wanna move back to the Seattle City Council at this point, because there's an interesting meeting happening this week for the Public Safety and Human Services Committee, headed by Lisa Herbold. It's gonna hear about the search for a new director of the Office of Police Accountability. Now, as you may recall, folks, Andrew Meyerberg left the job at the end of last year. He's now the Director of Public Safety for Mayor Bruce Harrell. I'm interested in this, David, just because I think about all the things this new OPA director is going to inherit. Some complex questions about how and when officers use ruses and disinformation, as they did during the CHOP protests in 2020, saying there was a group of Proud Boys protesters getting involved when they actually weren't. There's also the consent decree process that's reared its head again, how officers use force. That's actually getting reviewed in a separate meeting this week, too. And then we have this tenuous situation with SPOG, the Police Officers Guild, 15 months and counting without a contract. I guess I'm just trying to figure out this big question. I know the mayor is too here, David. What kind of person is the right fit for this job of OPA director?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of precedent because I think there only have been 3 of them, I want to
Okay,
say.
okay, okay.
Um, and so, each person that has come in has sort of taken a different approach to this
Hmm.
office. Meyerberg, he's a lawyer, and I think sort of approached it in a very lawyerly way,
Agreed.
which I think kind of rankled some folks who want to I think wanted to see him maybe push the boundaries of that office a little harder, whereas he
Hmm.
kind of really, and maybe this was all he could do. It's up for debate, but
Yeah.
um, he kind of he treated that office very much in the bounds of what he felt the office was authorized to do.
Right. Yeah.
And even more than that, sometimes when he would recommend discipline, he would do so kind of with an eye towards what could actually be sustained and held up by
Yes,
an arbitrator down the road. And so,
that's right.
kind of took it in a way of like trying to do the most with what he felt he had. And I think
Yeah.
that frustrated, which you can understand why as a lawyer he might take that approach. But I think on
Yeah.
the other hand, it may have frustrated some who want to see a more aggressive, an aggressive investigator in that
Yeah.
role. And so, for me, the question with OPA for me is always like, because no matter what, people are going to be upset with the director, whether it be
Sure.
the,
Oh, yeah.
the police
Hmm.
who are being investigated for discipline,
Hmm.
and feel it's being too aggressive, or
Yeah.
the public who wants to see more aggressive enforcement on police
Hmm.
officers. And
Right.
for me, I'm never totally sure if their frustration is actually with the director or just with the office and how it's built.
Right.
And again, because we haven't seen that many people actually hold that office, I'm not sure
Yeah.
exactly how far an individual could take it in any one given
You're
direction.
you're right when you talk about the three-headed entity there of the OPA and the Office of the Inspector General and the Community Police Commission. We haven't had that on the books for that long. So seeing how this evolves with the Harrell administration, I think is going to be very interesting. And I think it's also interesting to point out that Mayor Harrell is still talking about finding that new police chief, and maybe it's the old police chief. Maybe we stick with interim police chief Adrian Diaz here because the mayor has said this month, the month of March, he's going to make that announcement. So I look at the ways that Mayor Harrell has been dealing with some of the crime hotspots or whatever else. I feel like he's trying to, uh, I guess, allow police a little more leeway in terms of the job they do, and maybe you see it that way, or maybe you don't. I'm trying to figure out that choice for police chief too, because it's this age-old question of: do you look outside the department? Do you look inside of it? A few big positions here between the OPA and the police chief that the mayor has to fill.
Yeah, the police chief is interesting to me because if he is really going to make an announcement in March,
Yeah.
if that's true, it would actually to me be surprising if he did not choose Adrian Diaz,
Mm.
because he has not launched a national search unless he's doing it very quietly, and I
Yeah.
haven't seen any indication of that.
He's
And
he
so,
sa he says he's doing his due diligence, but keep going. You make an interesting point here.
right, but when in past, you think of how Carmen Best ended up in that. I
Mm.
mean, there was a whole committee of people. There was like many people involved in that who kind of
Yeah.
culled through all, and they hired a recruiting firm,
Yeah.
and did this national search, and then they forwarded a list of recommended candidates to Mayor Durkin, who then,
Mhm.
at the time, controversially made her choice. We won't go down that road, but and then
Yeah. Well,
with
and I
Kathleen.
will say Carmen Best too is not on that original list,
Well,
that the mayor
right,
looked at.
exactly. That
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
controversy.
You got it.
Um, but it was sort of a little bit of a spectacle, and I
Mm.
think there was some of that too with Kathleen O'Toole under Ed Murray,
Yep.
and we
Mhm.
haven't heard any of that, and
Mm.
and everything I have heard Bruce Harrell say so far is kind of implies that it's Adrian Diaz's to lose, but
Yeah.
at the same time, we don't, you know, Bruce Harrell's only been mayor for a few months now,
I
so
know. Right.
we don't know. I don't. This would be his sort of biggest and maybe first department head pick, and so we don't
Right.
know how he's going about this. Maybe he is doing his own national search and will come up with some name that we weren't expecting. I don't know,
Right.
but so far it isn't following the same patterns that we have seen in
Interesting.
recent years to
Mhm.
find that, unicorn
Yeah. Right.
candidate to come in.
Right, right. Boy, it's going to be interesting to look at that because it has been a question for so many years. But I have to think this is something that Bruce Harrell was thinking about even before he was elected. So a lot to consider here with this, and we'll see what the mayor does on that one. But I want to talk a little bit more about public safety, or what the mayor is talking about, how he's dealing with his interim police chief, how they're dealing with crime hotspots in Seattle. How's that policy working out for the city of Seattle yet again? Well, we're going to talk about it coming up on Now Hear This. Well, last week, folks, Mayor Harrell, Interim Chief Diaz, and a number of other law enforcement agencies, including the U.S. Attorney, the DEA, made an announcement about Operation New Day, the city's response to some hotspots of criminal activity in Seattle. Little Saigon at 12th and Jackson has been a big focus so far. And Third Avenue in downtown Seattle is the next neighborhood that's going to be seeing more police officers, a mobile precinct unit headed in there as well. But will that criminal activity get displaced to other neighborhoods? Well, Interim Chief Diaz says the SPD is simply not able to handle this all by itself.
One thing is certain, it cannot be done by SPD alone. We need help of all city departments, our federal law enforcement partners, the King County Sheriff's Office, Metro Police, the courts, and the jail. We need the support of our community. We all have a lot of work to do. Let's do it right, and let's do it together.
David, one concern I have about this, for as much as the mayor and others are talking about doing this together, involving community groups with non-police alternatives, those groups were not present at this press conference here. He's calling this a time of stabilization, sending in the police there, and then sending in social services after that. I'm just wondering, when will these different social service providers get involved? Who are they going to be? And will they really be on board with Operation New Day? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. It is a good question. I mean, you, the, I'm sure that a lot of these community organizations also have capacity
Hmm.
questions.
Yeah.
We've heard that before, which is at a time when a lot of people are talking about more community solutions and social workers and service workers and things like that. There is often a follow up of which ones exactly are we talking about,
Hmm.
and are there enough of them, and are they being paid well enough to stick
Right.
around and do this 24/7? There's a lot of questions around that. Not that they can't be fixed, but staffing issues are writ large, and
Hmm.
the kind of social service community work world is no exception to that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is interesting. I feel like I have a little bit of deja vu with the press conference with all these different agencies involved,
Hmm.
and it sounded a lot like the 9.5 block strategy
Yeah.
of, I think it was 2015.
Yeah. Right. Right. 7 years ago with that
Similarly
hearing. Hmm.
announced a bunch of arrests, and there were I think the U.S. attorney at the time was there, and
Hmm.
um, I mean, this hotspot policing approach, as we've talked about before, is one that
Hmm.
is done often.
Yeah.
It does, I think, probably make a visible difference right away, and then just the question is always about follow up. What
Yes.
what comes
Hmm.
next? And
Yeah.
um, we don't know. I mean, the fact that mayors keep doing this approach, I guess, would suggest that there maybe has not been enough follow up in the past. Maybe this
Yeah.
time will be different.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting to think about, and I also noticed what turned into a little bit of circular logic too when you talked about staffing with social service agencies. This was a chance for Interim Chief Diaz to be talking also about his own staffing for the police department, and he was mentioning this whole idea of, if this stuff moves around. I think his quote was, "If people move to Pioneer Square, we may need to increase our presence there too. But there's a limit to the number of places we can do that. We'll run out of capacity." There we go again. I just wonder how these different ideas feed into each other, and also feed this narrative that the mayor has been talking about trying to increase the number of officers on staff right now to about 900 or so, up to 1,400.
Yeah, I mean, we know that that's a priority of his to
Hmm.
increase. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, it's tough. I don't have a good answer to it. I mean, the
Yeah.
fact the fact that one of the areas that they're talking about has a name, the Blade,
Yeah.
that
Right.
people talk about. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a long, that particular stretch has persisted through many mayors and many police chiefs and many city
Hmm.
councils.
Hmm.
The fact that it has earned itself a name, and when people say they were talking to someone down at the Blade, you know exactly where they're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, again, suggests this is not like this is not just a snap your fingers and fix this problem
No, no,
thing.
that's for sure.
And yeah, I mean, I think like you said, at a time when staffing and the police department and social service agencies is stretched,
Hmm.
not to mention when a lot of things are still closed downtown,
Yep,
and you think about the
that
Macy's
complicates
building
things.
there.
Oh
It's
yeah, right.
massive building. It doesn't
Hmm.
have any. It's like a whole block of just walls, and now it's
Yeah.
empty. And it's
Hmm.
like, I think it's sort of hard to imagine getting arms fully around this until there is kind of vibrancy and traffic back
Right.
downtown again.
Right, right. It's such an interesting two pieces coming together here when it comes to transportation issues, when it comes to public safety issues. But looking at that Third Avenue bus corridor, that's a big part of this conversation too. And you're right. When we see those traffic volumes start to come back, it's going to be a very interesting situation there. But I did want to talk about that when it comes to businesses in the Seattle area, because this was another announcement last week about this, helping out small businesses with something called the Capital Access Program, $8 million in loans set aside for small businesses. They can take out $150,000 up to that, 4% interest. This money coming from the city's COVID recovery funds here. I just wanted to talk about this briefly, David, this loan type of activity for these small businesses. What kind of impact is this going to have, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think access to loans is, I'm sure, necessary at this
It's
point.
part of the equation. Yeah. Hmm.
Right. It's the city, of course, is restricted in what it can just give to businesses.
Right.
Mayors often run into that. I mean, I always think about the redevelopment of 23rd Avenue under Ed Murray. There was a lot of
Hmm.
accusations of gentrification and then
Sure.
wanting to help those businesses. And his reasoning was, well, I can't because it's a gift of public funds. And so
Mm.
I guess a loan program makes sense from that perspective, maybe. I'm not a legal scholar of the limits of public funds, but I suppose if it's a loan and they have to pay it back, low interest loan, they have to pay it back. That makes, I guess, some sense as a way that the city could be involved. But
Yeah.
yeah, businesses are hurting. There's no doubt about
Yeah.
that.
Right, and with the eviction moratorium wrapping up last week, or excuse me, expiring at the end of last week, it's important to point out that there are businesses that are in trouble too, and this type of funding can be used towards paying for rent, leases, things of that nature too. So it'll be interesting to see how this gets doled out here. This was another chance for Councilmember Sarah Nelson to talk about her involvement in economic development too. So something to keep track of as we see these numbers change over the next couple of weeks here. And I should point out applications for these small business loans that opens on March 8th and due by April 8th at 5 p.m. So get those applications in, folks. All right, we're going to move on to another story here. Super interesting here in terms of what we're talking about on the show. We're talking about if you got a raise. All right, you'd be happy about that, right? Well, there are some labor groups actually a little worried about this when it comes to a plan for statewide raises for Uber and Lyft drivers. Buckle up. Time for transportation talk. David, coming back here, you recently wrote about this state bill discussing a pay raise for Uber and Lyft drivers, which sounds great to have more money, but some labor groups are actually pushing back against this, which I found fascinating. What's going on?
This is fascinating. I find this story incredibly fascinating because so what this bill would do, and it's probably going to pass. I mean, it's passed both the House and the Senate on
Hmm.
fairly comfortable margins. It just needs to go back for basically technical agreement in the House again, and then it'll go to Jay Inslee's desk.
Hmm.
Um, so it would basically set a base minimum wage for rides across the state, guaranteeing a certain amount of money per ride, and then you know open up some benefits to drivers, like accruing paid sick leave and sort of creating a path toward unemployment insurance and pay and accessing paid family medical leave. So, opening up some of the benefits that employees are generally entitled to Uber drivers and Lyft drivers who are independent contractors.
Hmm.
Um, so, local labor is behind it, and then a good number of drivers are behind it. But the
Sure. Yeah.
interesting part is, as part of this, it would fully define Uber and Lyft drivers as non-employees, as independent
Hmm.
contractors,
Right.
and it would block any local city or county from passing more regulations or more fines.
Yeah.
And so it's not a huge surprise then that Uber and Lyft actually support this bill, that they are
Yeah.
behind this bill, because
Hmm.
for them, as we saw in California, they're willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars
Right.
fighting back against any effort that would classify Uber drivers as employees, because to
Right.
them, that's basically an existential threat.
Hmm.
Of course, kind of on the national labor scene from a philosophical standpoint, getting Uber and Lyft drivers to be called employees is a big priority, because they argue that would kind of give them access to more rights that are guaranteed
Sure.
to employees. But and then there's a lot of opposition too to the preempting of local cities from regulating, because
Yeah,
the argument there is, that's kind of where that's the laboratory
that's
of
right. Hmm.
government comes at the local level, and you're cutting off that possible innovation.
Hmm.
Um, what's interesting though is, we've heard some pushback from drivers at the local level who are, I think, I, some combination of not that interested in being employees.
Okay.
You talk to a lot of them, and true or false, are under the impression that becoming an employee would make their lives less flexible.
Yeah, that's
And
why
then
they took
also,
the job, to be flexible.
right.
Sure. Yeah.
And then also the argument from backers of this bill is, look, the conservative counties in Washington state are not about to pass a bunch of regulations on Uber and
Sure.
Lyft. They're not about to
Hmm.
give guarantee minimum wages. So, like,
Hmm.
who are you to criticize our approach when we are expanding these benefits statewide to places that
Right.
we're never going to do any kind of regulating?
You
It's
got it.
really
Right.
only Seattle. And so, it's this really interesting combination of kind of this broad philosophical concern that
Mm.
bills like this are putting all of us closer to becoming permanent gig workers
Yeah.
and depriving us of the rights that come with employees,
Mm.
versus a lot of the workers who look at this and say, screw your philosophical opposition. This gives me more money, and I want more
Right.
money.
Right.
And
Right.
so, it's
Because just to
super
jump in on that
fascinating.
one, yeah, just jumping in on that one real quick, because the situation right now is I'm a driver in Seattle. I want to stay in Seattle where I know I can
Yeah.
get some more dough. If there's a call out in Bellevue or something like that, I don't even want to make the trip. Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that was one argument that a driver I talked to made. He was
Hmm.
like, he's a Seattle driver, and he says
Yeah,
if he sees a ride and it appears that person is going to Bellevue, because in Seattle, we should say, has passed a lot of
that's right.
these regulations already. Seattle drivers are already guaranteed minimum wages and benefits.
Hmm.
So he's saying, if I get a ride and it looks like they're going to Bellevue, I'm not picking that up, because the second
Yeah.
I cross I-90 or 520,
Mm.
my guarantee of minimum wages goes down. And when he
Yeah.
does take those rides, he doesn't pick anyone up in Bellevue. He just turns around and drives right back to Seattle.
I see.
Um,
Yeah. Huh.
and so, he actually, interestingly, didn't think this bill went far enough to fix that problem, because Seattle
Interesting.
drivers will actually continue to make more than the rest of the state.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
but it was sort of a general argument in favor of passing a statewide
Hmm.
regulation, because then you level the playing field a little bit for drivers across the state.
At least a little bit more. Okay. Okay.
Super fascinating. It appears like this is going to pass.
Hmm.
Like I said, I don't see any indication. I wouldn't think that Governor Inslee would veto it, because it passed with uh, pretty overwhelming support in
Right.
both the Senate and the House. So
But it also makes me think, wait, if Uber and Lyft are supporting this, what's wrong with this? There's got to be something going on here.
yeah, and I think Uber and Lyft. I mean, there's a few reasons. I mean, but the biggest one is, I think Uber and Lyft have basically just come to see that this is the price they're willing to pay
Mm.
to take employment off the
Okay.
table, and to
Yeah.
they're going to save a lot of money over the long term by not needing to fight regulations at
Yep.
every level. If they just kind
Sure.
of come up with some bill like this that they can kind of live with, and
Yeah.
they take
Right.
employment off the table, and they take local regulation off the table, that in the end of
Okay.
the day is, maybe it'll cost them a little bit more money, but it's not an existential threat to their
Right.
business model.
Right.
And
Right.
they are
Right.
willing to pay a little extra money to take the existential threat off the table.
Interesting piece of compromise there. I'm
Yeah.
great piece there, David. Thank you for writing it, and I can't wait to see what your next one's going to be, because I know you got a lot going on with the state there. But I wanted to follow up on one last piece with you. This is something that I've been kind of wrestling with on Twitter myself. So we've got this Paul McCartney show coming to the Climate Pledge Arena in May, right? And so it's Get Back is the big video deal. You've seen it on. You've seen it on Netflix or whatever else there. So that's the thing that they're kind of pumping it off of. And so it's the McCartney Got Back tour. It's hashtag McCartney Got Back. And I looked at it, and a few other people have done this too, and they're like, wait a minute. How is Sir Mix-a-Lot not the opening act for this? Like immediately, Baby Got Back, McCartney about. Do you think is there a universe where that could actually happen? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know what the Venn diagram is of Paul McCartney fans and Sir Mix-a-Lot fans. I imagine it's a fairly thin overlap, but I don't know.
I don't know. He's done stuff with Kanye West. He's done stuff with Tony Bennett too. I mean,
That's
he's
true.
kind of all over the place. So it's like maybe I don't know. I just think
Maybe
what
he'll
I
make
wrote
a
on.
cameo.
Yeah, right. What it would just there's got to be something. I don't know if McCartney could shout out Posse on Broadway as well as anyone else, but we'll have to see how that pans out. So David,
Right.
I'm going to keep holding the torch for that one. We'll see if that pans out, and we'll let everybody know. Thank you for being with me, David. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks especially to our patrons. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. The podcast is on all the major platforms, wherever you listen. Again, please do support the show on Patreon. Always appreciated. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We will see you soon. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.